President Trump fires Kristi Noem, saying he plans to replace the embattled Homeland Security Secretary with Oklahoma Senator Markwayne Mullin. But is this a change of personnel, a change of policy, or maybe a little of both? Plus, what to make of the debate in the U.S. over Trump's strikes against Iran, including whether American forces might be running out of air defense interceptors.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues on the Journal's opinion pages, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Kate Odell. Kristi Noem becomes the first cabinet member to wear out her welcome with the president in Donald Trump's second term. The news breaking via the president's Truth Social feed on Thursday that he plans to replace Noem. Though it was a polite note, I must say, lauding Kristi Noem, saying she served us well, has had numerous and spectacular results, especially on the border. She'll be moving to a new position, special envoy for the Shield of the Americas. Kim, some reporting that the last straw for Trump, though, was Noem's floundering testimony before the Senate this week, getting tough questions from senators on both sides of the aisle, including Louisiana Republican John Kennedy. Listen to this.
But the president approved ahead of time you spending $220 million running TV ads across the country in which you are featured prominently.
Yes, sir. We went through the legal processes, did it correctly, worked with OMB. Yes.
He did?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Okay.
And one thing, Senator, I think would be helpful to know is how effective that communications has been. That
they
overwhelmingly
were effective in your name recognition. I mean, I personally just, to me, it puts the president in a terribly awkward spot. My research shows that you did not bid them out, that you pick, in fact, one of the people you picked, the strategy group, Safe America Media was a company formed 11 days before you picked them, and that the strategy group got most of the money, and the head of that is married to your former spokesperson.
Kim, that moment in particular seems to have piqued President Trump, who apparently got on the phone then after the hearing with John Kennedy. And according to Kennedy, his recollection of having approved or seen those TV ads featuring Noem was different from what she stated there at the hearing.
Yeah, well, the president has, in fact, since come out and just said, I didn't know anything about this, which raises all kinds of questions because Kristi Noem was in that hearing, presumably testifying under oath. So this is not going to be the end of that story. It's the beginning of this question. By the way, can I just note that I think it's kind of remarkable Donald Trump made it a whole year without firing a cabinet secretary. It's kind of a massive record compared to first term. But look, when you step back and look at this is a cabinet secretary that did two unforgivable things in Donald Trump's Washington. One, she had become a very serious liability. And two, she had done so in a way that essentially made her ego even larger than that of the president's, her profile. And I was always, I have to be honest, when she was announced as Department of Homeland Security pick and nominee, I kind of scratched my head. Because if you think about this was always going to be one of the biggest jobs in this second term administration. Trump had made immigration policy absolutely central to his reelection campaign. DHS is ground zero for that. This was going to be the person overseeing the huge job of sealing the border, overseeing drug seizures, which Trump had also made a priority, the entire arrest and deportation strategy, customs, all security related to air travel. Also overseeing a couple of agencies that have really been caught up in scandals and problems and that need giant reform, in particular, the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the Secret Service. And you looked at Kristi Noem, governor of a small state. She had certainly been a loyal supporter of Donald Trump. She had certainly advertised hard for a position in this administration. But this was always going to be an enormous job. And you asked yourself, is this really the right person to be doing it? And it turns out not. She certainly has had some accomplishments. I think you have to give her due. most importantly, the sealing of the border, although you could make the argument that Border Patrol was more than capable of doing that. And the only reason they hadn't up until then was because the Biden administration hadn't let them. I'm also personally grateful to Kristi Noem that I don't have to take my shoes off anymore in the airport. But, from the most part, it was pretty clear from the start that Kristi Noem's problem was that she was going to make this all about Kristi Noem. This self-promotion seems to have been most of her rationale in that job, whether it was the staged for TV visit to that El Salvadoran prison, looking all tough in front of the criminals, or this extraordinary ad, which features her riding a horse in Rushmore, galloping with the bison, kind of reminiscent of a bunch of self-promoting ads she ran while she was governor of South Dakota, in fact. So this is not a surprise to me, and that I actually thought this was maybe going to come even sooner, as soon as Minneapolis had become a big issue. There were many other concerns that were brought up in that hearing by Republicans, I would note. Republicans that were very concerned that the Minneapolis mess was actually making it harder to do effective deportations. A lot of people that were worried about the comments she had made about the killings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy and the immediate claims that they were domestic terrorists. So this was no longer Democrats complaining about the DHS secretary. This was Republicans who had lost confidence in her leadership. And that's usually the time that somebody goes.
Kate, the other context here is the Department of Homeland Security is currently operating in shutdown mode without funding because there's been this legislative logjam with Democrats saying that they need a comprehensive overhaul of immigration and customs enforcement, the ICE agency, and the way that immigration agents are operating. Republicans are saying that a lot of the things on the Democratic list are non-starters, but this could have been a moment, Noem's testimony, the DHS secretary's testimony before the Senate, to put Democrats on the spot there and say, listen, we are at a time of heightened tensions. The United States is barraging the terrorist regime in Iran right now. There's a real risk maybe of threats to the homeland. And we have people like working for the Coast Guard who are not getting paid. And coming out of the hearing, the headlines were nothing even close to that. It was all about the pressure that Noem was under for these scandals, some of which are personal to her, and some of which, as Kim says, agitated Republican senators as well as Democrats.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Kim that this has been building for a long time and didn't just bubble up after the hearing. That from reporting around Washington, there's been a lot of frustration with Kristi Noem and perhaps her own frustration with the White House as well. So I'm not surprised by this. And I think it is an opportunity for Republicans to reset here and get back on offense about the shutdown, because you're right that this is a particularly bad moment to not have DHS funded and to leave the Coast Guard without resources, as well as TSA, other security related agencies within DHS. So the president doesn't like to fire folks when the kind of heat is right on. I think that is one reason he waited to get rid of Kristi Noem until a later moment than the Minneapolis events. But now, look, I think the president has chosen Markwayne Mullin from the Senate to take her place. I think it's an opportunity for him to get the job under control, because I think right now it is a big vulnerability for Republicans in the midterm that the public thinks that the Trump administration isn't really focused on deporting criminals and bad actors. And so I think this is an opportunity for him to right the ship and get the politics back on his side a little bit.
Kim, what do you make of Markwayne Mullin and the job that is now facing him? Notable, even some Democrats in the Senate, where he's going to face confirmation hearings, are saying positive things about him. Here's Democratic Senator Peter Welch of Vermont. Markwayne, he's respected, he's honest, and he's competent. John Fetterman already saying that he plans to vote yes to confirm Mullin as DHS secretary. And I mean, part of the question here is the divide between the challenges that Noem had faced. Some of them were specific to her, like these TV ads we're talking about, questions about the planes that the Department of Homeland Security had been purchasing and her use of them to fly around the country, questions about her relationship with her top aide, Corey Lewandowski. She has denied that there was any romantic involvement there. Those things go away if you slot somebody else in. But Noem was also, when she led this push into Minneapolis, was following the guidance from the White House about the way the White House and the president and the top domestic aide over there, Stephen Miller, wanted border enforcement and immigration enforcement done. And so one of the questions I have is whether Markwayne Mullin is going to be able to bring a different perspective to those conversations in the administration, or whether he is going to be getting the same kind of orders from Stephen Miller that led Kristi Noem into the Minneapolis debacle.
It's really likely that this whole scenario changes now. And it's one reason why I would argue that Markwayne Mullin is a very good pick for this job. And in fact, the sort of person that should have been put in this job from the beginning. Mullin is actually known in the Senate as a very honest, as a straight shooter. He's a very solid Republican, but he has good relationships with Democrats, in part because he has that kind of personality. He's also become, if you've watched him over his relatively short career, and that, that's says something about the Senate, but and how long people can sometimes be there. But he has become, in a pretty short time, a very good spokesperson for the party. He understands policy and he can effectively communicate it. And I think that's the perspective that he's going to bring to DHS, and a new dynamic that has been missing. You very much get the sense from reporting that Kristi Noem was largely in the same place as Stephen Miller. She was not someone that was pushing back at all about kind of some of those White House demands and insistence, and in fact seemed more likely to be a person that was so interested in her own sort of political success and self-promotion. She wasn't thinking a great deal about the policy side of that, or the headlines that the party, that the department was getting, as much as her own standing. I think Markwayne Mullin is likely to not only be good at the implementation question, but will have some pretty smart ideas about the best way for DHS to navigate today's political environment. He'll probably be a better spokesman for the policies that the administration is attempting to accomplish. And I would argue he will probably be a voice within the White House counseling against some of the bad decisions that clearly were just otherwise broadcast down from the White House to Kristi Noem and put into place by her because she didn't question anything. So my read on this is that this is probably going to be a good add to this administration, and a partner for Tom Homan, the border czar, who has been doing a better job of trying to communicate and rein things in and tell the White House when things are going too far. I think that now those two will be working together and probably on the same page.
Let's turn to the debate in the U.S. about President Trump's strikes on Iran. First, the question about whether there is a risk of running short of air defense interceptors, particularly Patriots and THAADs, Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Interceptors. Let's start with a clip of Defense Secretary, or Secretary of War, if you prefer, Pete Hegseth, addressing this question this week.
We've got no shortage of munitions. Our stockpiles of defensive and offensive weapons allow us to sustain this campaign as long as we need to. Again, our munition status only increases as our advantage increases. Our capabilities, we have only just begun to fight, and fight decisively. Having a chance to hear from Admiral Cooper. If you think you've seen something, just wait. The amount of combat power that's still flowing, that's still coming, that we'll be able to project over Iran is a multiples of what it currently is right now when you add up our capabilities and those of the Israeli Defense Force.
Kay, you've been working your sources on the question of these air defenses. What's your read of the status quo and what we should make of it in terms of what it says for United States strategy in Iran and beyond?
Well, I think there's a lot of confusion on this subject, and it's helpful to divide it to three distinct categories. A lot of folks want to talk about drones and taking down drones. Let's set those aside for a minute and come back to them a little later in our conversation. And focus first on offensive weapons that we are dropping on Iran, and then also on interceptors that we are using to swat down Iranian missile and drone retaliation. Okay. On the offensive point, what Pete Hegseth is essentially saying, and has said for several days now, is that since the United States has such control of the air, it is able to use munitions that we have in a lot higher supply than some of our exquisite long-range standoff munitions, as they're called. You know, weapons. Those weapons would be in really high demand if the United States were ever to have a confrontation in the Pacific. So it's actually good news that the U.S. military is able to rely on weapons that are available in much higher stocks. And it's really an argument for striking the Iranians while there is a window of potential weakness and before they are able to rearm with Russian or Chinese air defense systems that would make our job much harder. Then there's the real question is on interceptors, on missile defense. And we have a known shortage of both of those interceptors, Patriot and THAAD, that you mentioned, that we use in a kind of a layered air defense architecture that we have. But before you get into that, that's an argument for picking up the pace in the first category that I mentioned, because what the U.S. forces are trying to do is destroy more ballistic missiles on the ground in Iran in large numbers, as opposed to when they're 10 seconds from, or a minute from hitting your base. And so that's a crucial distinction too, because we say in defense circles, missile defense buys time for you to take out the threat a different way. And that's what we're using these missile interceptors for, is to buy us time to step up our offensive campaign. And so, look, the U.S. has been trying to increase its production of Patriot interceptors. Was a framework announced this year that to go to 2,000 rounds a year from about 650 now. We know from the war in Ukraine that the United States is going to need more of these interceptors for any long fight that it has. Ukraine also, I mean, it's unfortunate because the United States has sort of forced Ukraine to just swat down missile after missile, but not really go after, like I was just describing, what makes Vladimir Putin able to use those strikes. So look, this is going to require a sense of urgency from the president to expand these lines and actually put up defense money behind them. There is a lot of conversation right now in Washington about a supplemental defense request to expand these stocks. I think this is the United States has not really started trying to get after this problem yet. I mean, the Trump administration put up a flat budget request. There's been a discussion on Capitol Hill that they're short billions of dollars for munitions that they want to buy. And so, look, yes, we are using a lot of missile defense in the Middle East. Yes, we need more missile defense, but we also have an opportunity now to recognize a problem that many people have been learning about for several years now, that we need to expand U.S. weapons stock. And so U.S. weapons stocks. So what I've been saying is, if this finally wakes up the United States to the fact that its missile and weapons arsenals are really not primed for the threats that it faces, that itself would be a national interest advance from the Iran campaign.
Kim, it does seem like there's an opening for some presidential leadership. And as Kate suggests, that was lacking, I think, under President Biden. And there are analysts who've been saying for years, we really need to focus on getting these lines moving faster. And to the credit of the defense industrial base, there is movement in that direction. So here's a line from the Journal's editorial on this munitions question. It says Lockheed Martin is aiming to hit 2,000 advanced Patriot rounds a year by 2030, up from about 600 now, and to quadruple THAAD production from 96. And Kim, that is great progress. On the other hand, if we had really done a crash course, maybe we'd be closer to that by now. And a question I don't know why the president isn't raising to the public and to defense appropriators is, how much money would it take these companies to add on 10 or 20% more to that output? And how fast can we do it? The right time to do that might have been 3 years ago or 2 years ago. But at this moment, there's no better time to start than today.
Well, I could not agree with Kate more that there is a real opportunity here, because sometimes you have these, actually, oftentimes you have these issues in Washington. Everybody knows that there's a problem, but they just drag on because there's no sense of urgency and there isn't any kind of moment where it all gets brought into stark relief. Well, guess what? We're at that moment. And that's actually good news, is waking up a lot of people. People are using actual numbers, talking about 20 billion needed for critical munitions that are still unfunded. And this is an opportunity for the president to step up, put forward a supplemental military funding request. And by the way, here's an idea: include in it, money for weapons that will support not just the Iranian campaign, but Ukraine as well. And then dare Democrats to say no to that. They've been complaining. And by the way, I think that's legitimate, that we are not doing enough to help Ukraine. And we can talk about this, but this is also just exposing this entire Iranian campaign, that we are fighting a joint enemy here. With we, meaning the U.S. and Ukraine, are fighting a common enemy in Iran and Russia. It's Iran who's been supplying Russia the drones that are attacking and overwhelming Ukrainian forces. So there's a real opportunity here to fix that. It's also an opportunity to push back and swat down those who are making the arguments. The Democrats who are saying we can't continue using these munitions because we don't have enough. These are the Democrats that have made sure we've had falling defense budgets so that we are in this moment anyway. But now we're suggesting that instead we need to stop and just hoard what we have. And in fact, I think what Iran is showing is the need to be doing this right now, before they had an opportunity to become an even greater threat. And also, you need to make the argument too about deterrence. We can build all the weapons we want and stockpile all we want and just have massive, massive amounts. None of it will matter if we don't somehow show that we're willing to use them at certain times to maintain global security and peace. And so I think that all argues against the hoard strategy and for seizing this moment to really ramp up on the munitions side.
On the debate over the timing of why the Trump administration decided to act now, here's a clip of Secretary of State Marco Rubio addressing that question this week that is getting some attention.
We knew that there was going to be an Israeli action. We knew that that would precipitate an attack against American forces. And we knew that if we didn't preemptively go after them before they launched those attacks, we would suffer higher casualties and perhaps even higher those killed. And then we would all be here answering questions about why we knew that and didn't act.
Kate, in some quarters, this is being taken as an admission by Rubio that the United States is being led into this by Israel. But to my mind, that doesn't really fit with what the Secretary of State was actually saying there.
No, I mean, it's very hard to even take this argument seriously that we were dragged into this by Netanyahu. And I'd also refer you to just some of Rubio's other remarks where he stated very plainly, why the United States decided to do this. And one thing that I thought he articulated really well was the fact that the Iranians continue to build ballistic missiles and to kind of use that as a shield for their larger nuclear ambitions. And Rubio basically said, look, we can't accept the status quo where they're building 100 missiles a month and we're building 6 interceptors. Now, we're building a few more than 6 interceptors, but he's right to say, okay, we need to increase the interceptor number and get the ballistic missile number on the Iranian side down through this campaign. And so, I mean, it took on a life of its own that Netanyahu dragged the United States into the war. And one more word about just how absurd that all is that the Israelis have clearly been a force multiplier to the United States in prosecuting this Iran campaign. And Secretary Hegseth said himself in one of the briefings this week that it's really remarkable to have a model ally where you guys can split up targets and get the job done. And so I'm honestly dispirited by this national discourse we're having about whether Bibi made us do it when it's clearly in our national interest and they're supplying a tremendous amount of help and support for the fight.
On that point about Israel's value as an ally here in this campaign against Iran, Let's listen also to California Governor Gavin Newsom and a potential likely 2028 Democratic presidential candidate asked at a book tour this week whether he thinks the U.S. should reconsider military support for Israel.
I mean, Freeman and others are talking about it appropriately, sort of an apartheid state. They couldn't even, I mean, we're talking about regime change. For 2 years, they haven't even been able to solve the Hamas question in Israel. So this is, I mean, I want to be careful here, but, in so many ways, that influence in the context of the conversation of where Trump ultimately landed on this is pretty damn self-evident. And so Rubio may have been saying something else in the context of what he ultimately said.
Do you think, looking down the road, that the United States should consider maybe, rethinking our military support for Israel?
It breaks my heart because the current leadership in Israel is walking us down that path where I don't think you have a choice but that consideration.
Kim, we'll give you the last word on a man who considers himself maybe America's next commander-in-chief.
First of all, I doubt anything seriously breaks Gavin Newsom's heart. But just putting that aside, I actually found these remarks very disturbing and a little repulsive in some ways, if you put this in the larger context in this regard. We are currently at war. And he was essentially putting out a call to cut off arms to our ally in that wartime moment. That to me ought to be disqualifying for anybody who wants to be a commander in chief, because I would just note that, our men and women are every day risking their lives as part of this action, but Israel's men and women are doing the exact same thing aside us. And they deserve a little respect in that regard, if nothing else. But the thing that I find a little bit more concerning and breaks my heart about Gavin Newsom's position here is that he is clearly angling, and this was proof that he sees his party very much abandoning its longtime affinity with Israel, by the way, which was repeated and reinforced as recently as 2024 when the Democratic Party reaffirmed that commitment to Israel in its party platform. But that has been changing. You have younger progressive activists who are hostile to Israel, and they are demanding that the party make this break. And Newsom is clearly making a political calculation here that this is the base that he's going to need to elect them. And so he's casting aside all of that tradition. He's casting aside sound thought and sense on this question of allies and regional pacts, just so that he can get some votes in a primary. It's certainly not an act of leadership.
Thank you, Kim and Kate. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back next week with another edition of Potomac Watch.